Hello and welcome to the podcast. I'm Karen Weaver. Korie Dean has written extensively about higher education and board governance in the state of North Carolina. She is the higher education reporter at the News and Observer, one of the largest media outlets in the state. Korie, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So you reported on a surprising letter that the UNC system president sent to the campus chancellors about the quote, rein in independent and unilateral actions, unquote, from some trustees that overstep the board's official and designated authority. You don't see that kind of admonition happen very often. Can you walk us through what led up to this and why?
Yeah. So as your listeners probably know, UNC Chapel Hill got a pretty high profile football coach recently, Bill Belichick. So to back up from that, Coach Mac Brown left or was essentially fired in the fall. And that kind of got the ball rolling where some trustees, specifically the UNC Trustees board chair, John Pryor, actually came to us at the NNO and spoke out against how athletic director Bubba Cunningham handled that. He called it shameful, didn't think it was handled in the best way. So that kind of laid the groundwork for there seemed to be some disagreements between administration, again, Cunningham and the UNC Chancellor Lee Roberts and the trustees. So this process kicks off to hire a new coach, and pretty early, there are some reports that Bill Belichick might be interested, which at the time seemed a little crazy. I think for people who
Far-fetched.
Yeah, exactly. And so that was just kind of an interesting thing. And, it was, well, will this really happen? And as it kind of got more serious, there began to be reports that the search was, it was used, people or reporters use words like dysfunctional or fractured, that there was the official process that the athletic director and the chancellor were following, but maybe that some trustees were going around that. There was a report that, again, John Pryor, the chair, had offered Bill Belichick the job out of turn. Trustees do not have that power.
Right.
So it was, again, the media reports about it really showed that it was kind of fractured and dysfunctional, and that, people involved in the process, trustees, were not following the roles that are expected of them, which is generally just to kind of be, advisory in that. And that is kind of how we've gotten to this point where, this was not the first time that the UNC trustees have skirted authority that they don't have. This was just kind of a very high profile example of it. And, as you mentioned, the system president has now reined that in and stripped some of their power over athletics.
So talk about, we'll start with that. He sent a letter to everybody. Now, the system is a big system. How many schools are in this system?
It is 16 universities, and then there's also a public residential high school, so 17 schools.
17, okay. Of the 16 universities, how many of them are Division I?
Oh, good question. I don't know the exact number, but the system includes, again, UNC Chapel Hill. It also includes NC State University. I would assume like UNC Charlotte, East Carolina are also D1. So we do have, some, obviously, an Appalachian State as well. Those are regional schools, but kind of have a bit of a national brand.
Okay. So it's an interesting structure because you're right. You have more than a handful of Division I programs reporting all up to a president, if you will, and then the chancellors sit on the campuses. Mm-hmm. You've got a board of governors. I want to make sure I get this right. That aligns with the system president, but then you've got board of trustees on each campus. Is that correct?
Yes, exactly.
Okay. That seems a little confusing. It could be for some people.
Yeah, it is. Again, this is kind of the letter that President Peter Hans sent to the trustees, again, was not the first time, but it's been going on for a while. And I think onlookers to a lot of it have thought, well, this is really confusing. Who has what authority here?
Yes.
And it's interesting, UNC got a new chancellor recently. I mean, he's been on the job for about a year. I've interviewed him, and that was one of my first questions was, these governance structures can be confusing to people, or people may not understand the actual organizational chart. And his first answer has always been, well, it's actually not confusing because chancellors report to the president and trustees are simply supposed to advise the chancellors. They really don't have a lot of actual authority over campus policies. And that's where it's kind of, when trustees try to have that authority over various things, whether it's been athletics or DEI, I think people who don't pay close attention to it, which is probably the average person looking
Yeah,
at this
yeah.
stuff, may get a little confused there. Yeah.
So, who hires the campus chancellors? Who's ultimately responsible for doing that?
That is the system president.
Okay.
So Peter Hans hired Lee Roberts to be the UNC chancellor. There is a search process that does involve trustees, and it involves members of the board of governors who, the system president reports to the board of governors. But the ultimate decision is the system president's, and he
Okay.
submits the name to the board of governors for their approval. But it's pretty much his say over a select group of finalists. Yeah.
So finally, there ultimately is one person in charge. It's
Yes.
just that
Yeah.
there's a lot of advisors going on around this, and that must get a little unwieldy at times.
Yeah, I think it does. It certainly does, and the board of governors sets policy for all the campuses, and then they're tasked with implementing it. So even just as an example, this week there's a new policy about campus protests that
Right.
passed. So the board of governors approved that, and now all the chancellors will be tasked with implementing that on their campus, making changes to comply. So yeah.
So one of the things you've written about is the fact that you think that, well, you've noticed a bit of a larger pattern of trustees overstepping their chancellors, and it surprises me that, athletic directors' job performance is being discussed openly in these meetings, because generally that's left to the campus president. So talk to us a little bit more about that dynamic.
Yeah, it has been interesting, and again, I cover higher ed, not athletics, so my
It's
view on
okay.
this is what I hear in trustee meetings, and maybe I don't know all the details about what goes on in the athletic department, but I would say about a year ago, the trustees kind of, again, like you said, started openly talking about the athletic director, Bubba Cunningham, in meetings, questioning his oversight of the department, the finances of the department, saying that the trustees weren't getting good information about budgets and how money was being used or spent. And all of this was kind of happening in the context of, it's spring, it's budget time, and the trustees have to approve the chancellor's budget plan. So, in the process of all of this, normally that is just an up or down vote, that the chancellor presents the budget to the trustees. It's a months-long process, and they talk about it at meetings all throughout the fall and spring about what might be coming. But typically that's just a vote to approve or not. And this past spring, the UNC trustees, again, called out the athletic director, called out the athletics department, and said that they wanted more information about money and all of this stuff in the budget. They also, this was at the time when the UNC system was banning DEI. So they also wanted more, or they wanted to redirect money from DEI to campus police as a separate issue.
Okay.
But this was kind of, again, last spring was kind of when all of this started coming to the surface of saying it publicly. It had evidently been going on for at least a few months, because the trustees then referenced that they had discussed the athletic director and the athletics budget in closed session, which is not allowed. It's illegal, and
Really?
they
Okay.
got
All right.
sued over that. But yeah, that's kind of how I became aware of all of this. And then again, with the high profile coaching search, it just continued and continued to bubble up.
And how long has this been your beat? How long have you covered this topic?
About 2 years. So
About two
this has
years.
been pretty much the whole time
The whole
I've
time.
been covering it.
So, when you came in, I'm sure people kind of gave you the lay of the land. What kinds of ideas did folks tell you about how this situation worked, how it functioned, or how it didn't function?
Yeah, I think the kind of overall idea that I was given was it's important to note that in North Carolina, again, we've talked about the Board of Governors, which is the system level board. They are appointed entirely by the state legislature,
Okay.
and our state legislature has been Republican controlled for about 15 years now. At various points, they've had a supermajority, but essentially it's been the Speaker of the House and the Senate leader submitting those nominees pretty much.
Okay.
The Board of Governors then appoints the trustees, as well as the state legislature gets a few nominees as well. So again, that's coming from a Republican-led board or Republican-led legislature. So, since about 2010, the prevailing, narrative or thoughts about these boards is that there may be partisan influence, that it's, they tend to lean conservative, or that it's, they're kind of ideologically similar. And that was kind of how I viewed all of this going in. And I knew that, people like to talk about UNC and NC State, they're the flagship. So they get a lot of attention. And especially at UNC, there's a lot of high profile controversies. I went to UNC, so I experienced a lot of this as a student. But if you think, we had a Confederate monument on campus, and
Yes.
there's a whole thing about that. We had, Nicole Hannah-Jones and the process to hire her and give her tenure. That was a big controversy. And so I knew going in that there was going to be a high likelihood at any given time that there would be a controversy at UNC or another school, and that, that would be a big part of the job. So,
Well, and it feels like that model has extrapolated to the rest of the United States, because it feels like everything is a tension now between donors, trustees, faculty, chancellors, or presidents. It just feels like everything is kind of up for discussion right now. Is that the way you feel?
yeah, I think so. I mean, I did a project a couple years ago. It was basically when I first started this beat. A lot of people talked about Florida and everything that was going on in Florida with higher ed. And, I started to notice that, well, a lot of stuff that's happening here in North Carolina is similar, if not identical, to what's happening in Florida. And so I started to look at kind of a more national look at how, national politics was affecting stuff in North Carolina. And I think obviously we're seeing that even more now, with just everything that's happening, to put it simply. So I think there's a lot more national attention on higher ed now than there has been, especially since I've been on this beat, but maybe ever, or just certainly in recent years.
Have there been any other examples? They don't have to be for athletics, but just a larger pattern of trustees in general in the system overstepping their bounds, kind of getting out ahead over their skis, that type of thing?
Yeah, and again, not to pick on UNC Chapel Hill, but this has kind of been the most evident or obvious example. So I mentioned last year when all of the athletics budget discussion was happening, the UNC system at the same time was kind of finalizing its repeal of DEI. Obviously, again, that's a national conversation, but the UNC system was doing its version of the repeal. So the system board of governors started considering that policy in April, and then it was set to be finalized in late May. They do these policies over 2 meetings. And between that time, when it was supposed to be finalized, the UNC trustees had this meeting where they're talking about the budget. Again, it's supposed to be an up or down vote. And instead of doing that, they directed the chancellor and his staff to redirect $2.3 million that was being spent on DEI efforts and put it towards university police and public safety. They had not, at that time, the system policy was not finalized, so they did not have a directive to do that. And also, they did not have the authority to line item amend the budget. I was like, we wrote about it, at the time, and they were like, they did this. But in my head, I was like, I don't really think they had the power to do that. And a few weeks later, when the UNC system did actually approve the DEI repeal, I asked the system president, Peter Hans, about this, and I was like, what happened there? And he said, no, the trustees do not have the power to do that. And he essentially, in talking to me, he explained that that's void, that did not actually happen. they could say that they wanted to do that, but that's not how the process works.
Okay.
So that's one example. Again, I think everything that happened with Nicole Hannah-Jones, I wasn't on the beat at that time, but I think, people have some questions about how that process played out.
Right.
So yeah, it's not a one-off thing with the sport, I don't think.
There's a pattern here.
Yeah.
Well, let's go back to the hiring of Bill Belichick. So we had trustees openly questioning the athletic department's budget. Not that this is your beat, but I would imagine that the pressure in the ACC of possibly Clemson and Florida State leaving and leaving the conference in a bad position, not having enough television revenues to be able to compete as they believe they have. So hiring Bill Belichick was a pretty darn big deal. Can you walk us through that?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you're right that conversations about conference realignment and the ACC specifically have just been, if not on the back burner, just bubbling up in the background of all of this. And, UNC for a long time, at least, I grew up in North Carolina. Again, I went to UNC. I've been a UNC basketball fan for a long time. And that's, when people think about UNC, they typically do think about basketball. But in this era of, conference realignment, it's really football that's the moneymaker. And UNC has been, I would say, like mediocre at football. We haven't been like a national powerhouse really. And, we also have stuff about NIL and revenue sharing and how all of that is going to shake out. And so the Chancellor, Lee Roberts, in explaining why they went with Bill Belichick was that obviously he's a national name, many Super Bowls, and that he could make the UNC football program a big moneymaker, that he could, bring in lots of NIL money and really put the program on the map that then would help fund all of the other sports, beyond men's basketball, but all of the others as well, and kind of position UNC a bit better in this ever-changing landscape of college athletics.
So they hire Bill Belichick. They give him one of the largest contracts for a head coach in UNC history, maybe nationally as well. And they give him an enormous amount of money. I don't have the numbers here for his staff as well. So we're spending a whole lot of money to hopefully get a return on that investment. How's it going so far?
Well, I will be very interested to see how it goes in the fall, but I think so far recruiting has gone well. I think he has, I mean, it's like dozens of new players, I believe. I could be wrong on that, but I mean, he's been on the recruiting trail. Recruits have posted photos of him in their like high school gym when he's on a recruiting trip. So he is making that effort, which is, kind of crazy to think about that, he's just going to a school in somewhere in North Carolina, but he's making that effort, and they announced the new, recruiting class, and it sounds like it's going well. I mean, he's also made efforts to connect with students. He delivered pizzas to some fraternities before a basketball game recently, and he's gone to basketball games. So I think he is making an effort to get out on campus and, show that he is interested in being part of the university community.
Yeah, and just to remind my listeners, in case they don't know, Bill Belichick was the head coach of the New England Patriots and won, I think, 7 Super Bowls.
I think so, yeah.
So this is a pretty different environment for him. And college is not pro, not yet. So there are a lot of nuances. Are you hearing from any of the trustees that, it might be too early to tell, but they're, watching him have a little bit of trouble adapting, or is he sort of molding the world into his worldview?
I think it's probably more of the latter. You mentioned the assistant coaches and all of the staff. I mean, they've really kind of revolutionized how the football program is going to operate. They hired Michael Lombardi as the GM, and that's the first time that the football program will have a general manager. I mean, so he's really talked about that it's not going to be just a typical college program, that he really is going to use a lot of what he learned in the NFL, whether that's how the front office was set up, or, player development or all of that. So I think it is that he's more shaping Carolina football to be more in his vision. And we're also seeing that, bleed over into other sports. The men's basketball team is going to hire their first general manager and have a front office staff. So I think that it's a lot of change towards that direction.
You know, in North Carolina, Chapel Hill has a tremendously successful Olympic sports program. Do you get any sense of how this might be impacting them?
Not any specifics, but and again, the party line would be that hopefully by funding football in this way, that it can then support the other Olympic sports. They have a very successful women's field hockey program, many national championships, women's soccer, those types. And Bubba Cunningham, the athletic director, did say in the opening press conference when they were introducing Bill Belichick that was a consideration of how do we continue to support all of these other sports, and women's basketball as well. So I don't have any specific examples, but I think at least they're promoting that would be the hope to continue supporting them.
Well, I think you touched on something interesting that I think Belichick understands is that the NFL sort of has had domination over the media ecosystem for decades. The Super Bowl just had 126 million people watching the game. People care about consuming their content. And I just read today that he's agreed to have the program be filmed in the NFL Films Hard Knocks series, which I believe is the first college program to do that.
Yes,
Do you have any reporting on that?
We wrote about it today, but I honestly have not read it.
Okay.
But I did see in the very briefly that I think it will be the first college program. So again, creating this college team to be more like the NFL.
Yeah, and so that's a first step. I also think about the tremendous impact that Deion Sanders had in Colorado with the media attention surrounding his program. From literally the moment he walked into the team room, he had cameras filming the entire, process, whether they're at practice or at games, traveling. He does a TV show on Tubi. He's out there generating content for the audience he's trying to develop, which is, of course, high school football players, but also, sponsors and donors and that type of thing. How do you think trustees will adapt to this new attention being paid to North Carolina and all the different ways, this will create a definition of their brand and that type of thing?
Yeah, good question. I think, and I'll say a lot of times I talk about the trustees kind of as a singular group, and I, would be remiss if I didn't note that there are some factions that not everyone was involved in the dysfunctional coaching search, for one, and not everyone agrees about how, not everyone agrees that about the allegations of budget issues in the athletic department and that kind of thing. And so I think that'll be interesting to watch of how those groups kind of handle this. And I think the group that has been concerned about budget issues in the athletic department and all of that has been kind of the more outspoken. And, there are in those kinds of trustees who say they want UNC to win a national championship in football, which kind of, again, as someone who grew up here, seems a bit unheard of. But, and so I think if that is the way that it goes, I mean, I think a lot of trustees will celebrate that and they'll say, oh, isn't this so great? I think, again, there are some who may be concerned about the process that was used to get there, and that that it wasn't really the trustees' role to begin with, that they should have trusted the chancellor and the athletic director. And so I think it will be very interesting to see how those dynamics play out.
Well, I do want to dive into the dynamics with the chancellor. I mean, do you get a sense that he feels like he has the support of the board and also the board is working cooperatively, or do you think that maybe they're working at odds to each other? What's your sense of that?
I think, how do I want to say this? I think the chancellor and the trustees work well together. I think the former chancellor, Kevin Guskowitz, may have had some issues there. He came from a more traditional academic background. Lee Roberts does not have an academic background. He was he worked in finance. He was the state budget director for about a year and a half, about 10 years ago. He was on the board of governors before he became chancellor, so he had to step down from that board. So
Oh,
he
interesting.
had
Okay.
worked with, he had worked with the system president, and I think they have a close working relationship. And it's kind of been interesting to see these memos where Peter Hans, the system president, is stripping some of the trustees' powers. Um, in a way that I think would help the chancellor kind of exercise his authority that he's supposed to have anyway. That,
Okay.
that seems to be kind of the dynamic of trustees needs to stay in their lane, have authority over what they do have authority over and not anything else. And so
Right.
I think those lines have been drawn a little bit clearer since Lee Roberts got into the job. And I think, obviously there's still some dysfunction as evidenced in the coaching search, but I think it's getting to a place where hopefully both sides understand what their true role is and
Yeah.
how to follow that.
How to stay in their lane.
Yeah, exactly.
Just for my listeners, in case they haven't seen or read the memo, can you highlight a couple of things that he drew lines in the sand and said, trustees, you will not talk about this, and this is what I need you to focus on?
Yeah, so there have been two memos. One was sent last year, and that was the powers that got taken away from the trustees there were pretty purely administrative. And that the line there was that it was getting the UNC board in alignment with all the other system schools. But that memo did include things about the trustees needing to set their meeting agendas a week in advance, which they're required to do, but in the past have not, and have introduced some controversial actions kind of on the fly that haven't been on the agenda. So that was the first one. The memo that was about athletics after the Belichick hire dealt a lot with hiring and raises for the athletics department staff. And essentially, the trustees do no longer have those powers. Where they're required to still approve the hiring of a head coach, they can't negotiate that. They can't be involved in the process to negotiate the terms. They can't really have any role other than just putting the stamp on the paper. And so now Peter Hans, the system president, has to review those from the chancellor and give his approval for a lot of those decisions instead of giving the trustees that power that they've normally had.
Some of my listeners might be surprised that the trustees had the gall to do that.
Yeah.
And that the chancellor, the system president, had to to actually issue that. So
Yeah.
that's what kind of made this feel a little bit unprecedented.
For
And
sure.
I guess the question was, whose job is it to keep them under control? Is it Peter Hans's?
I think so. Well, I think it is his, and there's the bylaws for the board of governors, I think, lays out the process of if you need to remove a trustee, how that works. We have not gotten there yet, and it would be, I mean, again, maybe unprecedented if we did get there, but it seems like right now the effort is to kind of rein them in before that becomes a need.
Right. Yeah. Right. Trying to draw the line in the sand, if you will.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. So last question, Korie, off the top of your head, how many trustee meetings do you go to a year?
Well, good question. So I think each trustee board meets 6 times a year. And so I typically go to all the UNC Chapel Hill ones.
Okay.
I go to a few NC State ones. And I also go to all the board of governors meetings, which I think are also about 6 times a year. So
Okay.
it's about once or twice a month because they rotate their schedules. So yeah, it's some long meeting days for sure.
Yeah, because those meetings are what, 7 or 8 hours at a time sometimes,
Yeah,
right? Yeah.
exactly. It's a full day thing, and it's actually over 2 days. So yeah.
That's great. Well, for someone who only recently graduated from North Carolina Chapel Hill, you learn more about higher ed in this beat than almost anybody else in the state. So
Yeah.
congratulations.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I enjoy it, and yeah, it's been really interesting so far.
No doubt. Well, Korie Dean, thank you again for joining me for providing some insight to my listeners about how boards can get off track, how system presidents can manage the process, how challenging it is to be a chancellor in this environment. And also, we'll be watching to see how North Carolina football does.
Exactly. Yeah.
Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.